Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and this is the new edition of Tomaskycast, wherein I talk to interesting guests who are doing interesting things. And today's guest certainly fills that bill in a big way, and we'll tell you why. Navin Nayak works in Washington at the Center for American Progress. Navin, hi.
Hey, Michael, good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So first, tell people what your job is there, what your position is, what
Sure,
you
I
do.
actually serve as the president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and that's essentially the 501(c)(4, means we can engage in advocacy, lobbying, and even elections tied to the Center for American Progress.
Center for American Progress, of course, is the leading liberal think tank in Washington. It's been in existence for almost 20 years now.
20 years. This year is our
Yeah,
20th anniversary.
this is the
Yeah.
20th year. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember. I remember when the first year, and I went to see John Podesta in an office that was about four offices ago. Uh, anyway, what Navin has done, folks, is that he's put together a PowerPoint presentation on democratic messaging and the economy that in my circles is like the talk of the town. That a lot of people are, he and Navin has shared it with a lot of people, high ranking elected officials, party operatives, people in the broader progressive infrastructure, people at interest groups and so on. And it's really turned people's heads because it has some information that when I first heard it at a dinner a couple of months ago, uh, really made me shake my head. But it explained a lot. And I think what he has to say explains a lot about where Democrats are on the economy. I'm sorry, I'm filibustering a little bit, but just for 30 more seconds, it's always vexed me that when I look at polls, which party is better at handling the economy? It's almost always the Republican Party. Even though if you look at the actual numbers throughout history, jobs created, stock market performance, median household income increase, and compare Republican presidencies versus Democratic presidencies, it's better under Democratic presidencies, and it's not even remotely close. But that's not the perception that people have, Navin. Why?
I mean, that's a great segue, and thanks, Michael, for having me on. I think there's a lot of different reasons why that's the case. I think the first is, as humans, facts are really the last thing that helps shape our worldview. That, facts attach themselves to narratives, and Democrats, unfortunately, have not told a consistent, clear narrative about the economy over, many decades, to be honest, but particularly acute in the last decade. I think the perception, and I'll hopefully be able to share some data here, that Democrats actually haven't prioritized talking about the economy, most particularly in the Trump era. That are, given understandably, all of the different assaults that Trump and MAGA have unleashed, Democrats have sort of pivoted to talk about a lot of other issues, and not to suggest those aren't important, because, lives are at stake. But the economy remains the top issue for most voters, and they don't get the sense that Democrats are talking about that or prioritizing it sufficiently.
Yeah. So for this PowerPoint presentation that you put together, you did some research about that. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we actually, did a lot of research. One, we actually spent some time on the front end talking to a lot of leaders in the Democratic Party and in the progressive movement to sort of understand why they, pose the same question you just posed. Why do Democrats continue to have a disadvantage on the economy? What is the Democratic message on the economy? What should it be? And candidly, those conversations revealed that there wasn't a home base for the party, wasn't a simple place that every Democrat could repeat. And, that's a pretty sharp contrast with the Republican Party, as you'll see in the research. And then we spent a lot of time actually just talking to voters and listening to voters and testing things with voters. There was a lot of different qualitative research, focus groups, online panels, a lot of quantitative research. I think we did 4 or 5 different surveys over the course of this. And then we also did a bunch of ad testing, as we came closer to having a theory of the case. Wanted to actually see how that looks in a 30-second ad and have confidence that it does resonate and work.
Yeah, we're going to look at some of those ads later. But and how long was this process?
We started talking to that first step of talking to Democratic leaders started last year, late last year, November, December. And then I think I did our first survey in February. And so it's been, 6, 7 months that we've been at this.
And what do they think? What do elected Democratic senators and members of the House think the problem is?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a real recognition that there isn't sort of message clarity, that there isn't a simple thing that sort of Democrats, from across the country and top to bottom sort of repeat over and over when it comes to our economic priorities. I think a second thing that a lot of Democrats sort of acknowledge is that as a party, we do care about governing. We do care about actually, Democrats do care about getting the policy right. And therefore end up spending a lot of time, a lot of layers down in the weeds of things. And, we consistently see from polling that the policies of Democrats are very popular. When you get to childcare, when you get to clean energy, you can go through even sort of the approach on taxes. All individually are very popular. What's lacking is a bigger story of the kind of economy we're trying to create, and where, families fit in it.
Yeah. You want to turn to the PowerPoint itself now and share a couple of slides with folks?
Yeah. And let me share my screen. Again, I'll just walk through a handful of these slides. There you go. The first, just kind of underscoring where you started this conversation, Michael, which is, it isn't that individual Democrats can't, be trusted on the economy. And a lot of Democrats, in order to win elections at an individual level, do that. But this data, and we've seen this consistently over the course of this project for several years now, is if you knew nothing about a candidate, but they were a Democrat up against a Republican, voters consistently say they trust Republicans more on the economy. And that varies between 4 and 10 points. And that's really sort of the problem we're trying to address. And one of the things, and this was sort of a new discovery for us, is, as you'll see, we do think there's a message clarity and consistency challenge, and that a real opportunity there. But the other problem we found is one of volume, that, our research team did a fantastic analysis at the start of this project to sort of understand how much of this is just a problem of volume, in that Democrats actually don't talk about the economy enough. And so our team looked at every press release, every Facebook post, and every tweet that every Democrat put out in all of 2022. 570,000 pieces of communication. Yeah. And, they found that, to our surprise, even only 5% mentioned the words economy or economic.
Jeez.
And yeah, so that was stunning. And I thought, well, maybe those aren't the words Democrats use. So we went broader. We looked at economy, workers, wages, jobs, working families, costs, much more in sort of a bread and butter kitchen table issue, where you would assume Democrats would really excel in terms of the volume of that conversation. But even that only added 6% more. And so, across the entire caucus in the House and the Senate, only 11% of these pieces of communication, Facebook, Twitter, and press releases, mentioned one of those words. And I was certain the data was wrong, Michael, to be honest. And so we actually had our team specifically look at Sherrod Brown. And on this last measure, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, he was at 40%. So he's spending almost half his share of voice, measured by Facebook, Twitter, press releases, talking about jobs, workers, wages, working families, costs. And on an average, the Democratic caucus in the House and Senate was at 11%. And so this really sort of made us realize that there is a volume challenge, that Democrats do have to, figure out how to talk about the economy a lot more, given its importance to voters. And it's not to say we shouldn't, prioritize other really important issues like abortion, threats to democracy, obviously very critical right now, but that we're getting the balance wrong. And you'll see some data that's reflected with voters as well. Yeah. And I wouldn't have bet, to be honest, that when we started this project, that the data would sort of guide us to sort of anchoring around this core priority that Democrats want to grow the middle class. And you'll see the data sort of took us there, that should be the North Star or the anchor of how Democrats talk about their economic priorities. I would have bet Democrats talked about the middle class all the time. If there's one thing you would have thought that was sort of a touchstone for the party. But when we did this analysis and went back and looked, in all of 2022, the middle class came up in 0.4% of
Dear Lord.
press releases, Facebook posts. And so sort of a reminder to me that over the last several years, as a party, Democrats have started using a lot of other words, everyday Americans, hardworking Americans, not bad words by any stretch, but that there is still a lot of salience in the notion of the middle class, and we don't talk about it nearly as much. And all of our other communications or topics sort of captured 89% of what Democrats focused on. And so, and this isn't lost on voters. When we ask about each party independently, how much is the economy a priority? Republicans have an 8-point advantage overall. They have a 15-point advantage with independent voters. And so there is this real sense that the Democratic Party doesn't prioritize the economy. And, what's concerning to me is even among voters who self-identify as Democrats, only half of them, 49%, say the economy is a top priority for the Democratic Party. And we have a lot of data. I can't show it to you here, but the economy is the top priority for the vast majority of voters, including Democrats, yet not even a majority think it's a priority for the Democratic Party. And so, that was really eye-opening. And this was, even more kind of stunning. We like to think that Republicans are the culture warriors, and obviously on so many fronts, whether it's book bans or transphobia, they're really driving that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But when we ask about each party independently, do they focus the right amount on strengthening the economy or too focused on cultural and social issues? The perception for voters right now is that Democrats are, the party that's too focused on cultural and social issues by double digits, and Republicans have an 11-point advantage as being focused the right amount on the economy. Now
let me ask you about that. To what extent do you think that reflects the reality of the rhetorical balance that Democrats are putting out there? Or does it maybe reflect that Fox News and others are talking about Democrats and social and cultural issues so much that that's the perception have, and that's the perception they have, and that perception is off?
It's a great question. I can't tell you for sure. The data doesn't tell us the why exactly.
Right. Yeah.
We have 3 different theories here of why this is the case. One is exactly what you're saying. Every time Ron DeSantis or Fox News talks about these issues, Democrats are a part of the story, and they say that Democrats are pushing these things, and that's why they're doing, whether it's a book ban or, pick your cultural fight they're picking, or choose your cultural fight they're picking. And so Democrats are a part of the story when Republicans tell it. That's the first thing. Yeah. 2, I do think, is the data we just showed, Democrats aren't talking about the economy enough, and so I think there is a perception problem in terms of what they hear from Democrats. I think they hear Democrats on a lot of other issues and not necessarily as clearly on the economy. And the third one is that I'm not sure sometimes that even when Democrats are talking about the economy, that voters are hearing it as an economic issue. And so, I think there is some real value in being clear-eyed about talking about our interest in actually trying to grow the economy and generate prosperity. And I think sometimes when our conversations exclusively focus on fairness and issues of equity, which are obviously really important, as you'll see in a second, it's not necessarily heard as an economic conversation. And I think that's the third sort of challenge we have.
Yeah. Just again, before we leave this screen, so on the right-hand side, those numbers, if I'm correct here, it means that like among voters who identified themselves to you as centrist, the view of Democrats is -34 on economy versus cultural and social issues, while of Republicans, it's +11. Is that correct?
Yeah, the -34 is meaning they think by 34 points they are prioritizing, they're too focused on cultural and social issues.
Yeah.
And focus the right amount on strengthening the economy.
Yeah.
And sort of these centrist voters align perfectly with the overall electorate with Republicans in terms of a +11.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Let's have more.
Yeah, just a couple more slides here. I think the last point I made, when we ask voters is it more important to grow the economy or to ensure economic fairness? Overall, the electorate will say growth, but that is disproportionately driven by Republicans. See, by 84-16, independents 2-1, more focused on growth. What's really interesting is just looking at Democratic voters, right? So liberal, people who self-identify as liberal Democrats, by a pretty sizable margin, say economic fairness is more important. Other Democrats, so people who self-identify as conservative or moderate, which is about 40% of the electorate, they're split evenly, right? They think both growth and fairness are important. And when you look under the hood, Black voters, slight preference for fairness, Hispanic voters, slight preference for growth, young voters split evenly. And, people who voted for Biden in 2020 split very evenly. And so what you kind of see is that for Democratic voters, they care about both growth and fairness. And their perception, when you ask them which one is the Democratic Party more focused on, is that Democrats are only their only priority, the higher priority is just fairness. And so not only when we have a focus on exclusively on fairness, we're missing our voters. We're missing Democratic voters. And so that really started getting us to sort of test this notion that we should anchor our economic story, our economic priority around this notion of growing the middle class, that we both care about growth and economic prosperity, and sort of really anchoring around this notion of fairness, that it's about the middle class. And we want more Americans to sort of have a secure place in the middle class, not just protecting folks who are there.
So
I'll do a few more slides if that's fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
One is just underscoring how much this is an economic growth story, right? When we ask voters, what do you agree with more, that you grow the economy by growing the middle class, or you grow the economy by letting businesses thrive? No partisan cues here, just their attitudes of voters. And you can see voters by a 2-1 margin, more than 2-1, believe that you grow the economy by growing the middle class. When we are talking about growing the middle class, we're not only telling a story of fairness, but we're telling a story of economic growth and prosperity. And it's much more powerful than the story Republicans tell, which is this is all about, letting businesses thrive. And
wait. Before we move forward, I just want to ask a question about that. So this is what Joe Biden says all the time, 4 times a week. So why it doesn't seem to be getting through?
I think the challenge is we've got to keep at it. I think this is, voters do not associate the Democratic Party with being the party that necessarily wants to grow the economy by growing the middle class. And so I think this is something that has to happen across the party in order to really stick. I think it's got to happen over more than a couple of months or even years, that this has got to be a long-term commitment to really shifting how the Democratic Party is viewed on the economy. And then I think we've got to say it with this sort of simplicity and clarity, which I still think as overall there's work to do.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, a couple more. Then we want to see an ad too.
Okay, great. Let me skip ahead and I'll just show you that. But the one thing I'll note on the slide that's here is, Republicans have been saying for decades, the way you grow the economy is shrink the size of government, right? Go back to Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And when you ask people what's the more important priority, growing the middle class or shrinking the size of government, again, by a 2-1 margin, people are much more inclined on that front. And so let me show you, I'll show you a 60-second ad. This is sort of the best testing story. And it really puts the economic narrative of growing the middle class in a longer term story. This isn't just about COVID and the challenges that Americans have faced over the last couple of years, but really puts the economic challenges in a broader context, which is where most Americans kind of believe the challenges.
So before you started, just to set this up a little bit more fully for people, you took all of this information and you produced a few potential ads for Democrats to use, and this is the one that tested best?
This is the one that tested really strongly. I mean, by far the best overall. I'll show you another one. It's a little bit of cheating sometimes, I think, when you show a 60 because you have more time to tell your story.
Yeah.
But this one tested the best. And I'll show you a 30-second version that tested incredibly well as also.
Okay.
It's been America's economic story for decades. Plants close, jobs get outsourced, costs keep rising, but wages don't. The guys at the top get huge tax cuts, while everyone else got squat. No wonder the middle class disappeared. Well, that's finally starting to change. Joe Biden is from the middle class, and his presidency is about growing the middle class, passing real plans to invest in the American people, rebuilding our infrastructure, ramping up manufacturing like semiconductors and clean energy. He's taking on corporate price gouging to lower costs, like a new cap on common drugs like insulin, and ensuring a secure retirement for working Americans, always protecting Social Security. All of it means that for the first time in a long time, we're investing in the American people again. Joe Biden knows that if more Americans have a secure place in the middle class, our entire country is stronger.
So that was the sort of strongest testing one. And I'll show you one that now does this as sort of a 1, 2, 3 plan, since Democrats like plans. I think the one thing that's worth noting, both in the last ad and this ad, which really came through in our research, is, people really think of the middle class as almost an emotional state, that you've achieved the middle class when you feel a sense of security, when you feel a sense of stability, when you have a little bit more control over your life and you're not constantly stressed. And the more Democrats can sort of tie their economic policies to sort of, providing those emotional cues, or tapping into those emotional cues, and providing that sense of emotional security and stability. And it's a perfect contrast with what MAGA is offering, which is chaos and instability broadly, but also in the economy. The more effective it's going to be. And you'll see the last ad did that, and this one does it as well in 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. You work 45 hours a week, but you're just barely getting by. President Biden knows it shouldn't be this way, and he just passed a real plan to grow America's middle class. 1, investments in middle-class jobs, the kind you can raise a family on. 2, lower the cost of living, like capping the cost of drugs. 3, making the biggest corporations pay what they owe in taxes. President Biden, growing the middle class, so Americans feel less stress and more financial security.
There you go. And, I think the thing I'd say just to close this out is that, we know that Democratic policies are popular, right? All through Build Back Better, when people
Right.
public or privately polled childcare, or they polled clean energy investments, or they polled capping prescription drugs, off the charts, really popular policies. What's been lacking is a bigger picture story. And so the primary recommendation here is we've got to connect the dots, that we're investing in infrastructure as a way to grow the middle class, that we're capping the cost of prescription drugs as a way to grow the middle class. And, the two overarching things, if we could say, if we had a magic wand, Republicans have been saying for decades, right, that you grow the economy by cutting taxes, reducing spending, and having fewer regulations. Said those 6 words for decades. We'd love for sort of the Democratic Party to say we're growing the middle class by investing in the American people and lowering costs. And if we could just say those kind of things over and over, that we are about growing the middle class by investing in the American people and lowering costs, I think it really taps in. It's simple, it's easy to repeat, and it really meets voters where they're at.
So you showed all this to a lot of the leading Democrats, and what did they say?
I think the reception has been really positive. I think I think there's a recognition that it's true to what they believe, right? We weren't trying to, come up with there's no special sauce here. It's not some, new phrase or magic word necessarily. It's just sort of re-anchoring around where I think Democrats are motivated. Like, these are the reasons Democrats push these kinds of policies. And I think it's sort of a recognition that, wherever you find yourself in the Democratic Party, whatever, if you're more moderate or more progressive, I think there's a real tie that binds here around this notion of growing the middle class and sort of providing people with this sense of economic security and stability. And so generally, I think the reception has been really positive. I think there's a challenge ongoing in terms of maintaining a sense of discipline and focus around these issues, because there are a lot of, as I mentioned at the start, a lot of pretty horrific assaults happening around the country on many fronts. And I think there's a challenge in staying focused on this issue.
Here's another thing I think about the Democrats' economic message, and have written several times, and others have said this as well. A lot of times in politics, you're known by your enemies. You're known by the enemies that you're willing to identify and take on and name. not enough Democrats are willing to name enemies, name bad guys. Biden does it fairly well. But, when you think of that kind of rhetorical posture, you think of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and Ro Khanna, I think, probably is in there. And that seems to scare a lot of Democrats, the moderate ones for sure, but just a lot of Democrats. They seem to not want to do that, whether it's because they're donors or whether it's because that's just not how Democrats talk. I don't know. But what about this concept of naming your enemies, naming the bad guys who are holding you, middle class Americans, back?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it makes me think of something else I'll mention in a second. But the first thing is absolutely and I think the place where it's particularly important and where Americans believe it strongly is on costs, right? Mm-hmm. They do believe that whether it's pharmaceutical, prescription drugs, healthcare, whether it's energy and gas prices, whether it's junk fees and surprise billing, they do believe that corporations in a lot of cases are ripping them off to increase their profits. And I don't know, the data is clear that just being knee-jerk anti-business is not a great place for Democrats to be. Mm-hmm. But to actually be the ones defending workers and consumers when corporations are actively ripping them off is a really important, powerful place to be. That people do feel like, whether it's at the gas pump or at the prescription drug counter, they are being ripped off, and that no one is looking out for them. And I think that is an important place for Democrats to sort of position themselves. Yeah. And the second thing I'll say, which I think the research really unveiled this to me, which is it's not that what Republicans say is all that popular anymore, Michael. Right? Yeah. Like, they say cut taxes, reduce spending, and fewer regulations. Well, yes, people want to see their taxes lowered, but they also want to see taxes raised on the wealthy and corporations. Yes, there's a lot of government spending people don't love, but overall, there's a lot of investments that people really do support. There's a real mixed bag on regulations. There are a lot of regulations people, see as vital: clean air, clean water, worker protections. What's powerful about what Republicans have done with that little the 6 words, they're all a contrast with Democrats. Every time they say we're going to grow the economy by cutting your taxes, they say Democrats are going to raise your taxes. Or they say we're going to reduce government spending, they say governments are going to increase spending. And so the other point you make that I think is really important is we've got to make sure that Democrats are drawing a contrast with Republican priorities. And when we talk about, when Democrats talk about investing in the American people, they've got to remind the American people that MAGA Republicans want to gut investments that families depend on. Yeah. It isn't just that they oppose these things. If you look at what they've proposed and voted on, they're going to gut investments in education, in infrastructure, in clean energy, in childcare. And, when Democrats say they want to lower costs, they've got to remind people that, Republicans are going to protect corporations even when they rip off families, whether it's prescription drugs or oil companies. And so it isn't just enough to remind Americans what you're for and what you're fighting for and highlight villains. Politics at the end of the day is still a choice. And we've got to remind voters of what Republicans, and particularly MAGA Republicans' priorities truly are on the economy.
Yeah. Last question. Sure. Do Democrats understand the crisis they're in, the trouble that they're in on this front? And do you think they really have it in them to get behind a unified message and be disciplined about it? Because a lot of people watching this would probably think they don't.
I've actually been pretty heartened over the last several years. I think if there's anything sort of any good that's come of the Trump era is sort of a recognition of the stakes and of the importance of, unifying everyone who, not just Democrats, but actually all those who sort of want to protect democracy. And I think one of the sort of outcomes that I think a lot of people believe is that, in order for democracies to sustain themselves and survive, they actually have to provide good material outcomes for working people and for families. And I think people increasingly see the connections between telling these stories around economic prosperity and fairness and, this isn't just a messaging exercise. This is sort of why we were excited about this.
Mhm.
Joe Biden and Democrats, and sometimes with some Republicans, have had the most productive first 2 years of any presidency in decades when it comes to investing in the American people, lowering costs, and sort of preparing the U.S. economy for the future. And people haven't heard that story, and it's a real story that's kind of taking hold across the country with, whether it's lowering of prescription drug prices or investments in manufacturing and clean energy. And I think it's an important part of restoring people's trust in democracy that they actually do hear that there are investments in the American people to actually improve their lives and provide more security and stability.
I lied. This is actually my last question because your mention of democracy reminds me of the thing that animates me on this, and you and I have discussed it previously. I argue, as you know, the Democrats need to make direct connections between their economic priorities and protection of democracy and expansion of personal freedom, because it's only through having a stable, thriving middle class that you protect democracy. Because when the middle class collapses, that's when people turn to demagogues. And I think that the Democrats' economic priorities of growing and strengthening the middle class and giving people more stable lives contributes to and expands personal freedom, because it's not freedom if you live in a small town where the options are to work at the dollar store or sell fentanyl or whatever. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, talks like this, and it stirs me. And it stirs me because I write like this, and that's my last book where I lay this out. But anyway, economics, democracy, and freedom, three legs of the same stool. Can that actually work, or is that just me being a pundit?
I actually think that's going to have to be what the 2024 election is about. Connecting the dots between the real threats to our democracy, to people's personal freedom, and to their sort of economic security have to go hand in hand. And Democrats' ability to tell a story about restoring all three of those, that there are more Americans who enjoy the security of a middle-class life, that more people have sort of not only personal but economic freedoms, and that we have a thriving democracy where the rule of law actually is upheld and people's voices are what determine outcomes in this country, including elections, is all tied together. And I think we've got to have that debate as a country.
I'm with you there. Now, can people see this full PowerPoint presentation anywhere on your website, or did they?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a link. Actually, I'm happy to share a link to it.
Sure. Okay, well, we'll drop that link into the text that accompanies this video. Navin Nayak, thanks so much. Really enlightening. I think people probably learned a lot in this last half hour. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Michael. Always a pleasure.